Welcome in to Check the Mic. It is Steve Palazzolo and Sam Monson. We're back again, Sam. This time breaking down the NFC South. If you're just tuning in, if you're just an NFC South fan, you still might want to go listen to the NFC East, the NFC North. They're already in the books. We're going division by division, breaking down every single team as we preview the 2024 NFL season. Sam, how you doing, man?
Yeah, new show name. Glad you found us here. I'm impressed. You haven't said the wrong name yet. You know, you're 100% so far.
100% so far. We will keep tallies. I'll get fined if I say the wrong name, misspeak. You know what I'm due. I'm due to misspeak sometime soon here. But yeah, this is Check the Mic, and if you just stumbled upon it, you know, don't be afraid to hit that subscribe button, whether it is here on YouTube or whether it is wherever you're listening to the podcast. It's a new feed. It's the same old show that we used to have, with some added perks and benefits from our friends at the 33rd Team. But yeah, we're going to be here every single week during the NFL season, 6+ hours of podcasting goodness. So we appreciate everybody for being here and tuning in. As we go division by division, Sam, same rules. We're trying to go 15 to 20 minutes per team, give every team their love, give a little best case, worst case scenario, some key players and storylines, and at the end we'll wrap it up with a prediction. Today we're going NFC South. And few teams were talked about as often as the Atlanta Falcons this offseason, particularly around draft time, because of what they did, drafting Michael Penix at number 8 overall. But Falcons bring in Raheem Morris as the new head coach. Our old friend Zach Robinson to call plays on the offensive side of the ball. We'll be referencing Zach quite a bit here on the show. Unless things go south, then we'll just, dismiss ourselves from knowing him. But a fascinating team. Kirk Cousins is in. Michael Penix picked at number 8 overall. What are your thoughts on the Falcons as we head into 2024, Sam?
Yeah, not just referencing our friend Zach Robinson. Hopefully at some stage we'll get our friend Zach Robinson on the show and actually, talk to him a bit. But yeah, Atlanta had a fascinating offseason. Obviously, they needed a quarterback. They had one of the worst quarterback situations in the NFL last season, arguably the worst. And yet they were still not a bad football team overall. But with a new coaching regime, they set about to fix that. And they did it first and foremost with free agency and Kirk Cousins, who was realistically the one kind of proven quality veteran option out there in free agency. And I know, Pittsburgh got Russell Wilson. They also brought in Justin Fields. There were other sort of options, but nobody as clean as Kirk Cousins in terms of the level he's been at over the last few years. Now, you do have 35 years old coming off an Achilles injury, so it's not like it was perfect, but theoretically, I think the Falcons, by upgrading from the kind of Desmond Ridder situation at quarterback to Kirk Cousins, immediately transformed themselves into a playoff team overnight. I mean, they literally became the favorites for the division if you check the Vegas odds, basically the second they made that move. And then obviously you get the draft, and everyone assumes they're going to then spend their top draft pick on a defender, try and bolster that side of the ball, and instead they double down on the future, essentially, and draft Michael Penix Jr., a quarterback that theoretically should not be seeing the field for at least a couple of years, which really is unprecedented in terms of the combination of factors, right? How high that draft pick was, the fact that they just signed Kirk Cousins, how old Michael Penix is, all these things put together. It's never really happened before that way. But you can kind of at least see the argument that they're going for, right? The succession plan, the Jordan Love idea, this concept of not just securing the most important position for this year, but for the next 12 years. I don't know if I would have done it myself, but I at least get what they did and why they did it.
We could spend hours talking about the Michael Penix Jr. decision, and we have, Sam, in the past, so we can't get too far into it. But the bottom line is, no team has made that type of quarterback investment at that level of extreme, probably in NFL history, as far as the money toward Kirk Cousins, and then in that same year, the number 8 overall pick. And the reason why I think it surprised people, or one of the reasons, is because at number 8 overall, the Falcons had their choice of the best defensive player in the draft, presumably one of those edge rushers. They need edge rush help, and we'll get into what that looks like on the defensive side of the ball. But that's the Michael Penix Jr. storyline. I hope that doesn't overshadow the fact that, as you mentioned, the Falcons should be the favorite in the NFC South. They're a team that went 7-10 last year with really horrible quarterback play, not just on a play-by-play basis, but in crunch time, right? In these close games when they had chances to either, hold on to a lead or go and win a game, and they're, throwing red zone interceptions. It was bad. And so this team had a feisty defense last year. That's how I always describe them. And then offensively, just, overflowing with playmakers, right? You've got Drake London on the outside. You have Kyle Pitts at tight end. You have Bijan Robinson at running back. You have Darnell Mooney coming in. And so this should be an explosive offense with Kirk Cousins at the helm. And, those playmakers really underwhelmed from a production standpoint because of the quarterback play over the last couple of years. And it'll be on Zach now to implement what looks like a very Rams-like offense, a lot of 3 wide receiver sets, trying to get their guys in space, playing to their strengths, but it's going to be a lot more pass-heavy than it was under Arthur Smith.
Yeah, and critically, Zach bringing that offense across, it's also basically the same offense that Kirk Cousins has been running and playing his best football in for the last couple of years in Minnesota. So it should theoretically create this kind of seamless transition for Cousins. And then, the key is looking at all those weapons that they have. And if we just look at the offensive side of the ball, I think the Falcons should be really good. They have one of the better offensive lines in the NFL. Maybe it'll look a little bit worse this season now that they're not the most run-heavy team in the NFL the way they were for the last couple of seasons. Maybe that stresses those guys a little bit more suddenly. Caleb McGarry, say, at right tackle starts to look a little bit weaker in pass protection, but it should still be a very good offensive line. So then you've got this backfield with, Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, multiple running backs that are high-quality players. The quarterback we just talked about is really good. Drake London, Kyle Pitts, those guys should be high-end receivers. And then can they get complementary play out of Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod, who came over effectively with Zach Robinson? There are some other complementary receivers there I think that can make an impact as well. Overall, that looks like an offense that could absolutely cook. And then the question is just how good is the defense going to be? Can it help them out?
Right here on the Check the Mic channel, you'll see one of our other videos talking about, important players across the NFL. I highlighted Drake London, and I really think he's going to have a monster year. A guy that was drafted, same draft class as Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, Jamison Williams, right near the top. He was the first guy off the board. I think his high-end ball skills, his ability to also separate, win in different ways, outstanding at the catch point. I think he has a chance to be the high-volume receiver in this offense. And just to touch on Cousins for a minute here, the NFL, when you're evaluating quarterbacks, a lot of times we think in this, do you have an elite quarterback or do you not type of terms, and clearly I don't think we're putting Kirk Cousins into that elite category. He's in that category where teams want to move on from him, right? You feel like you're maxed out at some point, but when you're a team like the Falcons that's working with the worst quarterback situation, or one of them in the NFL, they didn't have one of the top draft picks. That was the necessary move for the Falcons. So it's a big upgrade for them, and plugging Cousins into this offense. Look, I don't know that this is leading them to the NFC Championship or anything, but I think it's giving them an opportunity to win the NFC South, get into the playoffs, and see what happens. So I like the fit for Cousins here for the Falcons because of all the playmakers that they're throwing that he's throwing to. And then on the defensive side of the ball, Sam, we've got new news that may have hindered our ability to use our pre-recorded analysis on the defense. Matthew Judon is in town in Atlanta. Justin Simmons is in town in Atlanta. Look, the defense last year, I always called them feisty every single week, right? Jesse Bates was out there making game-changing plays. David Onyemata was a really good free agent signing last year. Both of those guys as free agent signings helped this Falcons defense, but even more ammunition added here during the preseason, and then Raheem Morris coming in to pull it all together.
Yeah, a couple of players coming over that had such a transformative effect that it transformed what I'm wearing and my entire studio setup here. Amazing effect that they've had on that defense. Yeah, look, we had this whole thing recorded, and we were talking about the anemic pass rush that the Atlanta Falcons have had for the last couple of years. One of the worst, if not the worst, edge rusher situations in all of football. Chicago was right there with them until they traded for Montez Sweat, and now Atlanta have made a move as well, and they bring in Matthew Judon, who at the very minimum upgrades it. I'm not sure he fixes it single-handedly, but he definitely changes the dynamic there. They at least have got now one consistent pass rusher, a guy who has had big sack seasons in the past, a guy who also, you've made this point before, has the ability to drop into coverage, to do more than simply line up and rush the passer from the edge, but can move around, can drop into coverage, can show up in these simulated pressure packages and cause problems for opposing offenses. So Judon, I don't think immediately fixes their pass rush, but definitely moves them back towards average from literally the worst situation in football in that regard.
It does, and that situation would have been Lorenzo Carter, Arnold Ebiketie, and, two guys that are probably better off as third pass rushers. At least knocks them down a peg, allows them to mix and match a little bit more, and then, as you mentioned, some flexibility with a guy like Judon who can drop into coverage. He's been a guy that drops over 100 times per season historically in the past. Ravens defense, Patriots defense. So I think it's a good fit for Raheem Morris in the Falcons. And then Justin Simmons coming in as well to pair with Jesse Bates, two ball-hawking free safety types. It's not your traditional free and strong safety. It's not your traditional box versus deep player. Both guys have similar skill sets. But I think that, again, the veteran versatility that it brings to the defense, added with Judon and that pass rush, I think those are great moves. And it helps a defensive front that the Falcons knew that they needed to address in the draft. After they went with Michael Penix Jr., they did draft defensive linemen with their next 3 picks. Now, Braylon Trice is out for the season, the third rounder. That's part of the reason why they had to bring Judon in. But Rook Orororo showing some flashes during the preseason. They've got the ability to mix and match up front and maybe create some havoc.
Yeah, it was definitely an area that they knew they needed to upgrade, and that's why they spent those draft picks. Braylon Trice probably would have been a significant contributor for them, a guy that they were relying on him. Obviously, they can't do that now, so instead they pivot and they go and grab a veteran. An interesting move as well because, cost them a third-round draft pick. That's pretty significant. It's also for a guy who, wants an adjusted contract. Like, part of the reason there was some issues there in New England is he wants to get paid again, or at least wants a change in his contract, but that doesn't seem like it's happening in a major way in Atlanta. They're not bringing in a guy that they're going to, re-up for a huge amount of money, at least not right now. So they are kind of playing him out really just for this year to try and upgrade that group, presumably because they think that they will be a playoff team and they are going to try and make some noise and contend. And even a one-year rental works for them at the moment.
I want to highlight key position groups because I do believe it is on the defensive side of the ball for both of us. For me, it is still this edge rush group, even adding Matthew Judon. Again, we're looking at Raheem Morris coming over from the Rams, and they didn't really have a great edge rush situation over the last couple of years. It was Aaron Donald who created all of the havoc. Now, the Falcons have Grady Jarrett. Their version of Aaron Donald, of course, we would never compare Grady Jarrett to Aaron Donald. He is not at that level, but he's your interior disruptor. David Onyemata can do some of that as well. But, Raheem's edge rushers would, drop into coverage, rush the passer. They haven't really been the guy that's relied upon. So I think that kind of fits, but they needed a little bit more juice off the edge there. That's where I think adding Judon is going to help. It'll upgrade it a little bit. They still might not be even in the middle of the pack as pure edge rush group goes in the NFL, but it gives them a little bit more flexibility to pair with those interior disruptors of Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata, Zach Harrison as well, a guy that can move around. So look, that's a big group for me. It takes a little bit of pressure off the back end if they can get more pressure with their front four.
Yeah, I mean, even with Judon coming over, I still think that that's an area of weakness for them and maybe a key area for the entire team, for the defense. The single biggest area of concern for me, or key area, would be that number 2 cornerback position, though. A.J. Terrell, I think, is a really good player. His life will be made easier by the fact that Judon is now there, bringing some kind of source of pressure from the edge along with those guys in the middle. But that second spot, that number 2 guy, and even the number 3 guy potentially, outside of A.J. Terrell, their cornerback positions are not amazing on paper. A guy like Mike Hughes is potentially a starter as the number 2 guy. Now, that's helped by upgrading up front with Judon. It's helped by potentially upgrading behind them as well with safety. But still, that's an area that could absolutely be exposed by high-level starting NFL wide receivers.
All right, let's flip it forward to this entire season here. A best and worst case scenario for the Falcons. What does your best case scenario here look like?
I still think that the best case scenario has a ceiling to it. I think that they're a playoff team. Their best case probably involves not just making the postseason, but maybe winning a game or two there, upsetting a team. I just don't see that they can really get through to, a Super Bowl or even maybe a championship game. I feel like their ceiling is probably at that level and no further.
I think the best case, forget about where they end up on their way to the Super Bowl, right? I mean, I'm with you. If they made it to the final 8, much like the Bucs did last year, I think that would be a pretty successful season, winning a playoff game, getting into the divisional round. But I think the best case involves a lot of excitement, man. You got Kirk in there. You got Zach Robinson calling plays. You have all those playmakers, all those first-round picks from the last few years at all the skill positions, and you get to see all those guys play to their potential, the potential of Bijan and Pitts and London. So I think we've got a lot of excitement and big years on the offensive side of the ball for the Falcons if everything goes right. What about worst case scenario, though? What if things don't go so well?
Yeah, I mean, the worst case probably involves some kind of Kirk Cousins not being the same, coming off that Achilles injury at 35 years old, not having solved the quarterback position definitively with what they've done this offseason, the Kirk Cousins addition of free agency, Michael Penix Jr. at the top of the draft. If somehow that doesn't result in unequivocal, correct answer at quarterback, that I think is the worst case, which ends up with them not being any better than a year ago, with them still not being a playoff team, with them still being trapped in this kind of purgatory world of not really having line of sight of the next quarterback and not having the quarterback. I think that would be a true worst case scenario for the Falcons, that with all this upgrading, they still didn't really move forward.
Yeah, and that's what, look, Cousins is a very good quarterback, but at the end of the day, every team he's been with, he's made them better, but they've hit a ceiling, right? Which is what you've highlighted. I would also throw in on the defensive side of the ball those two key position groups that you and I mentioned. If cornerback 2 or the pass rush generally, if that's not up to par with playoff caliber teams, could be rough on that side of the ball for the Falcons. We have friends all over the NFC South, Sam. As we move on to the Carolina Panthers. We have old friend Dr. Eric Eager is now the director of analytics over there. So we've got all of our old friends in the South. Big rivalries here. But Panthers, we've got year 1 of Dave Canales, year 1 of Dan Morgan officially being the general manager, and year 2 of Bryce Young. And we've talked quite a bit about Bryce Young and the disappointment that he was really as a rookie. It wasn't unprecedented that he was disappointing. There's a lot of disappointing rookies. But you and I kept trying to pull these comparisons. Who disappointed in year 1 and by year 2 or 3 had really turned the corner, especially as a number 1 overall pick? And you have to go back to the Matthew Staffords of the world and Jared Goffs of the world that have turned it around. And then if you expand it, you could look at a Tua and say, like, he had two subpar years before he really turned it on. So it's the biggest story in Carolina. What is Bryce Young going to be? And can Dave Canales, the new head coach, get the most out of Bryce Young?
Yeah, year 1 was pretty much a catastrophe for everybody involved. People got fired at the end of the year. That's how badly it went. And I do wonder, obviously it was terrible for Bryce Young, but I do wonder how much of the perception of how bad it was is conditioned by the fact that he doesn't have any redeeming and obvious sort of physical traits that jump off the tape in a positive direction, right? So when a guy like Bryce Young or even a Jared Goff, when they struggle, right away, you're left with this feeling of, like their career is in trouble because they just look bad. Whereas when a guy like Josh Allen, for example, struggles year 1, it's like, okay, it's mostly bad, but look, here's an incredible throw, here's an incredible run. Like, there's positive things to get excited about. And you're like, if we can just, weed out the bad and get the good. But you can see it, right? You can see the reasons to be excited. With Bryce Young, you're just sort of left with this. This is going terribly, and he looks tiny, and he doesn't have the arm to make sort of special throws left and right, and it just looks concerning. But I wonder how much of that is just like false perception because the physical traits aren't there, and actually it's no more concerning than any other rookie struggling year 1, which happens quite a lot. But year 2 is all about getting him back on track and seeing a significant jump forward, like a real elevated pathway of growth with Canales, with a new offensive line, with new receivers.
The comparison I always used was forgive me for repeating myself again, Sam, but 2016 Jared Goff, because there wasn't a whole lot of hope. I mean, it was literally like one or two throws every couple weeks. You're like, okay,
right.
There it is. Is he going to come out of it? Is he going to turn the corner? But I like that comparison because it's not all just Bryce Young last year. You would look at the playmakers themselves. Nobody's getting open. The scheme wasn't helping. The scheme wasn't getting anybody open. The line was giving him issues. Every time there was a big play, he's under pressure. That was Goff as a rookie with the Rams. Everything was bad. It was the last year of Jeff Fisher. And in year 2, Sean McVay comes in. Jared Goff looks completely different. The Panthers, I wonder how much goes into hiring Dave Canales as the head coach, looking at his recent track record now. He's the QB coach that got the best out of Geno Smith with the Seattle Seahawks. He's the offensive coordinator in Tampa Bay last year, getting the best season out of Baker Mayfield, or at least the best season since, year 2 or year 3 of Baker Mayfield. And being quarterback friendly and playing to his quarterback strengths and getting the most out of those guys. I mean, that's going to be a fascinating story to watch. Can Canales work his magic again with Bryce Young, who you and I both liked coming out? We're not like, hey, told you so. We both liked him a lot coming out. The question was his size, but he looked like he had NFL playmaking ability and all the tools necessary to be successful.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the quarterbacks that have struggled as badly as Bryce Young did right away and turned it around, almost all of them, something changed around them. It wasn't just them, flipping a switch and getting better year 2. Something changed around them. Even guys like Josh Allen, right? We don't know how much of it was Josh Allen, how much of it was Stephon Diggs got brought in, and suddenly he's got an amazing number 1 receiver to throw to. So if you're looking for hope for Bryce Young, even independent of his own growth and what he can do to get better individually, they have upgraded everything around him, right? Canales theoretically should be an upgrade schematically and coaching-wise from what was a mismatch last year of coaching and scheme and ideas. Now you've got one guy with a very recent, successful, proven track record of helping quarterbacks out. Number 2, the offensive line. That line was terrible last year, and it shouldn't have been as bad as it was. But Carolina have gone out and they've completely overhauled that group, and they've brought in several new players that theoretically, basically the entire interior should be completely different, right? You've got Ike Ekwonu at left tackle, who underachieved but shouldn't be as bad as he was last season. You've got Taylor Moton at right tackle, who's a really good player. But now you've got 2 new guards, Robert Hunt, who's a good player, Damian Lewis, who's been solid, and then Austin Corbett comes back at center. That's a completely new trio, and that should all be better. And again, the interior might be really important for a quarterback that is short, small, and doesn't have the same kind of pocket stature as some other quarterbacks do. And then lastly, receivers, right? Last year, no receivers. It was basically Adam Thielen, and nobody else is capable of getting open or getting any kind of separation. Now you've got Deontay Johnson, who specializes in route running and separation and getting open. You've got Xavier Legette, a big-bodied, fast receiver that can go up and catch it at the catch point. So they've made real strides in that area as well. And one of the big adjustments, we've talked about this for years, Steve, particularly coming out of Alabama with the run of receivers that they've had for years, the difference between when a quarterback drops back to pass, looks up, and is deciding whether my guy is open or not. At Alabama, that guy is 5 yards open, right? There's nobody within sight of him, and it's an easy decision. Put the ball in the air. The NFL, open is like, does he have inside leverage on an in-breaking route, even if there's a cornerback like all over him? That's open in the NFL. It's a totally different picture. And I think sometimes that the better your receiving core in college, like the harder the adjustment is, because it's so much different. Whereas quarterbacks in college that aren't necessarily throwing to amazing receivers, it's a little bit closer to the NFL picture. So a guy like Bryce Young, I think it's a big deal, the transition that he has to make, given that difference in receiving core.
It's a great point on the NFL Open thing. I mean, I think you're going to get some college open from Deontay Johnson. I mean, he is a very good route runner, a very good separator. Bringing him in to pair with Adam Thielen. Remember, Thielen has kind of settled in. I always use the comparison of late career Reggie Wayne, who just went. Reggie Wayne was a nice vertical threat. He was fast, but his last season, it was just like Andrew Luck's possession guy, right? His underneath threat. That's what Adam Thielen's kind of settled into, I think, at this point in his career, is he's lost some explosiveness. I think that combination, though, at least gives you multiple options now between Thielen, Deontay Johnson. Lets your guy, Jonathan Mingo, just be a vertical threat with his size and his speed. He's not the most polished route runner, but you need that guy, in my mind, the 3 or 4 receiver to just be a stretch the field type. So they have the types, right? They have the basketball team that we talk about, having the different styles. I love Jatavian Sanders coming in as a yak threat in the draft, and then Jonathan Brooks at running back. They got him in the second round, coming off of injury. I think he was the best back in the draft. If he wasn't the best, he was close, near the top with some of those other guys. Yeah. I think he has a chance to be a really good player. And so if we're painting this picture of best case scenario, it involves that offensive line, which is on paper our favorite line, creep back toward average. They have the pieces to do that in Carolina. They haven't been average in years in Carolina from an offensive line perspective. They have the pieces to do it. They have on paper pieces. I don't think they're one of the best receiving corps in the NFL, but it's certainly better than what they were last year with those playmakers. First rounder Xavier Legette added to the mix. If you play to his strengths, he's really explosive. So there's a lot of good pieces there. Best case scenario, they all come good, and Bryce Young takes that next step with Canales.
Yeah, no, I think their best case scenario, it's short of some of the other teams. Their best case scenario is just signs of life from Bryce Young, right? You come out of next season confident that he is actually the guy, and you have a quarterback, and you're not going to have to start over again. And if that's the case, you're getting some kind of viability out of the team this year. You're competitive. You're not vying for the number 1 overall pick that might not be yours at the end of the season the way it was last year. You're actually a half-decent football team, even if you're not necessarily in the playoff hunt or a real threat at the postseason. That, I think, is the best-case scenario for this team.
So let's talk about the defense a little bit. We spent so much time on the offense, and rightfully so. Again, that's going to be the story for Panthers fans. Defensively, they traded Brian Burns this offseason, and just like we were talking about the Falcons, the pass rush is going to be a big question. I think it's a similar question in Carolina. You've got Derek Brown as a big body interior player. He's really the only threat on the interior as far as affecting the quarterback. He's become one of the better defensive tackles in the league. That's why he's making his $24 million a year. But the edge rush situation, DJ Wanham, Jadeveon Clowney comes in on a 2-year deal now for Clowney, the rare 2-year deal for Clowney. Caleb Von Chason as a reclamation project, DJ Johnson. I mean, they do not have any household names besides Clowney rushing the passer. I think that's going to be a big question on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, I mean, the defense is obviously in some kind of transition. New general manager as well, Dan Morgan, sort of wheeling and dealing. We saw a little bit of that in the Giants Hard Knock series where he was shopping Brian Burns to the Giants, where he ultimately went. So Brian Burns is gone. Dante Jackson at corner is gone as well. They're sort of slowly turning over this roster. Frankie Louvu departed in free agency. So they're letting go or getting rid of some of these guys, but they haven't necessarily replaced them yet. And that's been a trend for the last couple of seasons of Carolina. They've sort of made these deals and haven't backfilled them quickly enough. So obviously when they made the deal to get Bryce Young, it involved giving up DJ Moore. And we saw the consequences of that last season with the lack of receivers. And then this year you trade away Brian Burns, and now you're looking at this group on paper like, this is a pretty weak group of pass rushers, right? Jadeveon Clowney is the one proven edge rusher that they have. And we know Clowney is inconsistent and doesn't necessarily bring it every week. So outside of him, there's not that consistent source of pressure and a guy that's really going to dominate the way Brian Burns could.
Yeah, guys like Shai Tuttle, your run-stopping specialist at nose tackle, had 2 pressures last year, Sam. 2. So
not great.
They need some help there. I mean, that to me, that's one of the key position groups. I want to go back to kind of painting this best and worst case scenario. So best case scenario, we talked about it on the offense. Defense, I mean, somebody steps up. Clowney has had some decent years. He's never been a great pass rusher. I mean, just having J.C. Horn healthy in the secondary is huge. When he's out there, he's been a very good player, just battled so many injuries throughout his career. Dane Jackson has been solid at corner. I think they have the pieces to have a decent defense. It's not flashy and shiny, though. I mean, a comparable defense, a solid defense plus Bryce Young's development. I mean, that's the biggest thing here. And then you think about, I don't know if they're competing for the division this year. I don't know if you care if they're competing for the division if you're a Panthers fan right now. I want in 25. I want to feel good about Bryce Young, and in 25, feel great about Bryce Young, and feel great about the pieces around me. So we're competing 1 year from now. But maybe I'm setting expectations too low for a best case scenario. But that's what I'd be looking for. Just that Bryce Young development, feeling good going into 25.
No, I think it really is like a binary best and worst case scenario for Carolina. Like the best case is you feel good about Bryce Young coming out of the season. The worst case is you feel bad about Bryce Young coming out of the season. It was
back
basically
to
the same as last year. Yeah, and then you're back. You start over in a year that is, at least right now, being talked about as not phenomenal at the quarterback position. So the best case scenario is Bryce Young rescues his career, bounces back, and he's worth the number 1 overall pick. The worst case is he looks like he did last year, and now you might have the number 1 overall pick again in a year where there might not be a quarterback worth the number 1 overall pick.
So how would you highlight a key player or position group, obviously other than Bryce Young, who we've talked about quite a bit?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's Bryce Young as the real answer. So by extension, then, I think his wide receivers become the next most important thing, right? As much as theoretically they're all upgrades that they brought in, Deontay Johnson has had drop issues in the past. That's not going to help. He's got inconsistent hands, great route runner, not necessarily great at catching the football, which is a fairly important part of the job. And then Xavier Legette, incredibly talented, incredible physical specimen, but is quite raw and sort of relatively one-dimensional as a receiver. He's big, fast, quite angular, doesn't necessarily run a full route tree, is great at the catch point, but he's not like a complete dynamic option at receiver yet.
Who people are hearing when you say that is Dave Canales' own DK Metcalf. That's what people were trying to make that comparison, throughout the offseason.
And there should be like synergy there, right? Like DK Metcalf, he's developed as a receiver and become a much more well-rounded player, but even without being that, you can make a lot of use of him early by playing to his strengths and not asking him to do the things that he doesn't do well, and simply, asking him to do the things that are effective. So I'm not saying for a minute that, the Panthers can't get anything out of Legette until he becomes this well-rounded guy, but it's a question mark. Anytime you take a guy like that, you're like, okay, we're limited with what we can do with this receiver. That group needs to not just be an upgrade on paper, it needs to actually materialize as a significantly better receiving core for Bryce Young to work.
Yeah, I'm with you on the receivers basically they're the key, and I don't think there's that quote true number 1 when you look at the former quarterbacks that turned their careers around early on, the Jalen Hurtses and the Tuas of the world. They had an alpha receiver who was a top 5 type of player in the NFL at his position, A.J. Brown or a Tyreek Hill, and you could say Josh Allen had Stephon Diggs, who was probably top 5 to 8 at his position when he went to Buffalo. So you don't have that necessarily for Bryce Young. But it's a potential good mix. It is two veterans who get open in Thielen and Deontay Johnson, and 2 young upside players in Mingo and Legette. And I think of that group, if you can get 3 that you could depend on out of the 4, that's going to help Bryce Young's development a ton. So I'm looking at the receivers as the key. And it's still kind of a rebuilding year, I think, for Carolina to get some another year of getting talent on both sides of the ball to build the roster back up. Because the other piece here, Sam, to get Bryce Young, they gave up a lot, right? It looks really bad when you say on paper, here's what they gave up, and by the way, the picks became Caleb Williams and all these other players that were added here. They're depleted because of the investment that they had to make to go take a chance on a quarterback. So it takes some time to build that roster back up for the Panthers.
Yeah. It's definitely a gamble that they need to actually get right. If they don't, they gambled more than the average because they didn't start with that number 1 pick that Bryce Young was acquired by. Right? They had to give up to get to number 1 and then take the guy. So if it doesn't come their way, it was an even bigger mistake than it would have been if they'd simply been sitting at that spot.
All right, let's go to the New Orleans Saints. To me, one of the more disappointing teams in 2023, not because I think they were a great team. They had one of the easiest schedules in the NFL. Really, the NFC South had all easy schedules, essentially. And the Saints, I think, they had what looked like the most stable quarterback position going into the season last year before we knew Baker Mayfield was going to break out. And they finished 9-8. It was the same record as the Bucs. They lost the tiebreaker. They don't win the division, but it feels like the Saints should have won the division last year. And they're in an interesting spot here, Sam, because they're the team you always like to reference. They max out the credit card, right? They keep pushing the credit card balance into year after year, and it's like, when's it going to come back to bite? And I think you're slowly seeing the depth on the Saints roster get a little bit more depleted. They've been one of the better drafting teams in the NFL over the last 10, 12 years. I think that's slowed down just a touch. It's year 2 of Derek Carr. What are you looking for the Saints here and their big stories heading into 24?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing for me is Derek Carr, I think, had a slow start to his career in New Orleans. But by the second half of the year, Derek Carr was actually playing some pretty good football. So does that continue heading into year 2? Like, did he just take some time to acclimatize and get used to a new offense and new receivers and all those kinds of things? And now Derek Carr is going to be who we thought he was going to be when they signed him? Or is he just that inconsistent and you can't necessarily rely on him playing at a very high level for, half the season? If they can get him playing at that level and he picks up where he left off, then I think the Saints are back in the hunt as, a genuine division winner, even with Atlanta having Kirk Cousins now, and even with Tampa Bay, having discovered Baker Mayfield, if he backs that up. But if Derek Carr is just that inconsistent, that's the concern. So, I think he should theoretically be capable of playing at a very high level. They've got receivers to play with, even if that group has had some turnover and maybe been depleted. Chris Olave, I think, is a really good player. Rashid Shaheed is an outstanding deep threat and gimmick type of receiver. He can take, screens, all those kinds of things. You got some young guys now in A.T. Perry, who made a really nice play in preseason, his first week. Bob Means, the low-drafted guy this year, rookie. And then it's a case of what is that offensive line going to look like, because that group has completely fallen apart over the last few years.
Before I want to touch on the line and those playmakers you talked about, but the other factor here is they're going with the Friends of Kyle strategy when it comes to offensive coordinator. They're bringing in Clint Kubiak, who was the passing game coordinator for the Niners last year. Of course, Gary Kubiak and it's the West Coast tree. Where's the tree start? Is it Mike Shanahan? Is it is it Gary Kubiak? But it's Friends of Kyle. This has worked recently. The last pass game coordinator that went from the Niners to becoming an OC was Bobby Slowick, turning the Texans around with C.J. Stroud. This feels like it's a lot to overcome, though, because of the offensive line. And what you and I have said, sometimes it seems like that scheme can overcome the bad on-paper offensive line, the offensive line that looks like, I don't know if they can do a whole lot. But they scheme it up really well. They use angles really well in the run game. They protect the quarterback through the scheme, through getting receivers open quickly. But this one could be too much to overcome here, Sam. There's a lot of moving parts here. Ryan Ramczyk has been one of the best tackles in the league since 2017, since he was a first-round draft pick. He's injured. He's out at right tackle. They're moving former first-round pick Trevor Penning from left tackle to right tackle. Penning has been banged up and underwhelmed when he's been on the field. They drafted Talise Fuanga in the first round out of Oregon State. He played right tackle at Oregon State. He's moving to the left side. And then your guards are Lucas Patrick, Cesar Ruiz, most likely. Neither of those guys has been great in the majority of their career. They're good at center with Eric McCoy. So you're literally talking about 4 out of 5 positions that are questions. And when I like to look at an offensive line, the O-lines that I say are good, the ones where I say 4 out of 5 I feel good about, right? That are not question marks. And if you have one question mark, all right, that's fine. We could probably work around that. But we're talking 4 out of 5 question marks up front for the Saints.
Yeah, you hear the 80-20 rule all the time, right? In business and all kinds of things. That's the offensive line is the 80-20 rule as well. If 80% of your line is good and 20% is bad, you've got one of the best offensive lines in the NFL. If 80% is bad and 20% is good, you might have the worst offensive line in the NFL.
You can't 20-80 the offensive line. It's the old adage in business. You cannot 20-80 the offensive line. So I've got concerns there. And Derek Carr, he's not the best when he's got he's under heat all the time. No quarterback really is. I don't think he's the type of guy that overcomes poor pass blocking or even poor run blocking that puts them into 3rd and longs all the time. It's going to be tough to overcome up front.
Yeah, it is. It's been, that group has really eroded, and they've tried to repair it. There's some 3 first round picks are on that offensive line right now. two of them haven't worked out, and that's part of the problem. Like, Cesar Ruiz hasn't been a good player on the interior, and then Trevor Penning so far has been injured and a disaster. And then obviously Fuaga, the rookie, we haven't seen from him yet. But that's a problem, right? Anytime you spend multiple high draft picks at a position and it simply doesn't work out, you are behind the eight ball, particularly if you were relying on those positions and actually contributing right away. And the Saints have been that style of team. Like, they have been the type that relies on their drafting and targets players and earmarks them for significant roles with the confidence that they're good at this. They can draft players, they can identify talent, and that'll fix a position. And when you swing and miss multiple times at that, you put yourself in a problem spot, and that's basically what's happened to them on the offensive line.
And I would say Derek Carr is similar to that Kirk Cousins situation, right? We've seen years where Derek Carr was a top 10 caliber quarterback, produced like a top 10 quarterback, and other years where he was closer to 20. And he's somewhere in the 10 to 20 range, closer to 20 probably at this point in his career. But he could give you top 10 quarterback play. He's got to play better in the red zone. Remember, that was a key story for the Saints last year. Playmaker-wise, you mentioned some of the guys. I think Chris Olave, excellent player. Rashid Shaheed's ability to get behind the defense is just unbelievable and extremely consistent. Juwan Johnson has been a little up and down at tight end, but he's shown the ability to stretch the seam. And they're talking up Taysom Hill, even though he's, almost our age, Sam, almost in his 40s. Taysom Hill, we're going to line him up all over the place. He's going to be awesome again. So Taysom Hill aside, I think the playmakers are legit for the Saints. The O-line's just got to hold up a little bit better. And then I think defensively, kind of similar questions. They had one of the better defensive lines in the NFL just a few years ago. Lose a Trey Hendrickson, you lose Marcus Davenport, Cameron Jordan gets a little bit older. You're trying to replace all those guys with several top draft picks, and the jury's still out on a whole bunch of those guys. The Peyton Turners of the world, the Brian Bressees of the world, Isaiah Foskey's of the world. All these guys, first and second round picks. They need those guys to step up and get the Saints defensive line from really one of the worst the last couple of years back to where they were when they were the best team in the NFC South for a couple of years.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. Like, the Saints had a run where they were one of the best drafting teams in the NFL, and they had a ridiculous strike rate throughout the draft, which is still, a relative crapshoot. But they were really good at this, and that's when the Saints were at their best. Their talent was really good. They were able to restock with the draft. They brought in a bunch of fixes. And then the last couple of years, they've sort of hit the downside of that. They've hit the bad end of variance, and the wheels have fallen off. And just a ton of these high draft picks that they spent on both sides of the ball simply haven't worked out yet. And we hit the ones on the offensive line, but Peyton Turner was a high draft pick who hasn't contributed really at all. Brian Bresee, okay, the jury's still very much out on him, but he didn't look an impact playmaker year one. They need him to be significantly better this season. Foskey, as you mentioned, has not made a real impact yet. Like, these are players that they need to show up in a big way. Otherwise, that defensive line is extremely depleted. And, okay, Chase Young coming in is an interesting gamble to try and potentially fix that on a relatively sort of buy low proposition, roll of the dice. Cameron Jordan is still a good player despite his age. Carl Granderson is useful, but the big X factor, or the thing that's going to determine how good this defensive line is at least two of those three high draft picks that we talked about before, Bresee and Foskey. Like, are those guys actually going to take a significant step forward, or are they going to be more underachieving high draft picks that become like let down areas?
I've been bullish on the Saints the last couple of years, even last year, right? I thought that they could have done more. 9-8 isn't a disastrous season. I thought they had 10 or 11 wins in them just because of the schedule. They should have a favorable schedule again this year. If we're talking best case scenario, I think all of these question marks that we're talking about, the youth movement on the offensive line, relying on young players at tackle, the defensive line relying on these younger players to step up, like, all that needs to come good, essentially. And then you're talking about the Saints, I think, competing with the Falcons for the division, and it's the same expectation, right? Maybe win the division and, sneak a playoff win if you get the higher end of Carr throughout the season.
Yeah, I think that the best case scenario for the Saints is probably similar to that of the Falcons, right? It's you win the division, you maybe win a playoff game or two. I don't really see it including being a truly elite team, Final Four, Super Bowl type of thing. I don't really think they have that in them. But if things do go right for them, they've got enough talent that they could still win that division when nobody should be dominant, and potentially beat a couple of teams in the playoffs.
Worst case scenario, I think it's. I hope we're not skewing too negative here for the Saints in our discussion, but I think it's the worst roster that they've had in the last 9 or 10 years. Since maybe the middle of the Drew Brees era. Maybe we'll say more question marks now than they've ever had, especially on both lines. At the same time, they've had that ability to play some lockdown defense and step up at times and get the most out of their players. But worst case scenario, I think the O-line is a disaster. I think that affects Derek Carr, and you get the low end of Carr. Maybe you're talking about Spencer Rattler or Jake Hayner taking over at some point just to see what you have. Thinking about moving on from Carr at some point during the season, and the defense, all the talent that they've lost over the last few years just comes back to bite. I mean, I think those are all possibilities this year.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like their worst case scenario though is still pretty high. It's still a reasonably high floor. They're too good. There's too much talent in this roster for them to be a total and utter catastrophe outside of the standard injury caveats that is true for everybody. So I think like the worst case scenario for them realistically is they're not better than last year. The teams around them have potentially gotten a bit better, certainly in Atlanta's case, and they just sort of struggle to playoff missing mediocrity, right? And they're in that 6-7 win type of range where they're outside of a top end draft pick, but they're never really threatening the postseason.
The one thing I want to add before I want to talk about a key position or player, there is a lot of potential at corner. Marshawn Lattimore getting a little bit older, but I think he's still capable when he's out there. Paulson Adebo coming off a really good year. The ageless wonder of Demario Davis in the middle of that defense. They just re-signed Pete Werner. I mean, they do have talent on that side of the ball to affect opposing quarterbacks and make life difficult for them. I just think they need the D-line to step up as we talk key position group. To me, it's the defensive line. Who is it going to be? Do they get the best of Chase Young? They took the 1-year flyer on Chase Young. I'm always willing to take that chance because I think he still has the opportunity to get back to where he was earlier in his career before the injuries. One of the Peyton Turners or Brian Brzee of the world affecting the quarterback. One of those guys needs to step up. And then key position group-wise, the two tackles, not only Penning trying to prove himself, but moving from the left side to the right side. Fuanga moving from the right side to the left side as a rookie. A lot of moving parts and question marks there. But if those guys, settle in, that helps a ton and might offset what I thought would be the worst-case scenario where the offensive line is really struggling.
Yeah, I think the entire offensive line for me is the key unit. Every position is almost every position is a question mark, like you said, 80% of it. The 80% of it, I think, we just need to figure out what that's going to be. Fuanga is a really talented guy. That guy absolutely moves people once he makes contact. He's pretty solid in pass protection, but he is flipping sides. Trevor Penning has not been good in the NFL, but he's like the classic old school road grading right tackle, which doesn't really exist in today's NFL because right tackle, left tackle, it's basically become the same thing. So if he couldn't hang on the left side, there's no real indication that he's going to be able to do it on the right side because it's not a hiding place anymore, right? So if he's just not able to play tackle, he might be your guard. And
it's almost incurring more risk because you have two guys flipping sides, so they're both trying to get comfortable at positions that are of equal importance.
But the solution now to a guy like Trevor Penning, who's powerful, strong, but is really struggling from a technique standpoint, the solution to that now might not be flip him from left tackle to right tackle. It might be flip him from left tackle to left guard, right? That might be the solution to those types of players. But either way, it's a real concern and a risk for the Saints right now.
All right, man, let's wrap it up with the Tampa Bay Bucks. If you were listening to us last year at this time, we probably weren't saying a whole lot of positive things about the Bucks, right? We didn't know what they were going to be. We didn't know that Baker Mayfield was going to have that breakout rejuvenation last year with Dave Canales and that offense. They started out slow, 2-7, but they end up winning, going 9-8, winning the division, winning a playoff game against the Eagles. So, by all accounts, really successful 2023 season for the Bucs. And now the question is, can they build upon it? Right? Canales is off to Carolina. Liam Cohen comes in after going back and forth between the Rams and Kentucky over the last few years. So Cohen's got really good experience with that McVay system. Looking forward to seeing what Baker Mayfield can do now that maybe there's expectations on him. As former big-time Baker believers, Sam, we've been burnt, right? Every time it's like, all right, he's turned the corner, it's time. And then he disappoints you. And then you were out on him. You quit Baker Mayfield, but he looked really good last year on that playoff run.
He did. He looked good. I'm still not ready to completely buy into Baker Mayfield. I still think there's absolutely a risk that we get a regression this year. Unfortunate for them losing Canales. Not much they could have done about it, obviously. I think Liam Cohen is a good guy to kind of bring in to offset that. It's a new system for Baker Mayfield, but it's one that he's been in before. It's not like he's learning a completely new system. And at this stage, he's been in so many systems in the NFL that there can't be that many systems out there that he hasn't already had previous experience in. So we've reached the critical mass that it almost doesn't matter what kind of system you bring in. Baker's been in it before at this stage. But their offseason was about, I think, keeping a lot of their players intact. Obviously, Mike Evans was potentially a free agent. They kept him around. They now have that receiving group in really good shape. Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Trey Palmer, the deep threat from last year. Jalen McMillan, a rookie, who's been getting rave reviews as a possession type of slot receiver. That's a really good group to work with for Baker Mayfield. And an offensive line that improved last season. Tristan Wirfs at left tackle anchoring the group. The thing is there for Baker Mayfield to back up last season's success, but it doesn't mean he will.
Yeah, so from a receiver standpoint, I think they probably needed to add Jalen McMillan, who is tearing it up at camp, to have a more dependable, true slot receiver, to go with Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, and it helps future-proof the roster a little bit as Godwin's making $20 million a year in the last year of his deal. Maybe allows Trey Palmer to be the deep threat there. So they have the pieces, again, assuming I think they're going to throw more receivers out there maybe than they did last year, more 11 personnel, 3 wide and 1 back. Offensive line-wise, we always question the move from right to left tackle and vice versa, but it worked for Tristan Wirfs. At left tackle, it worked putting Luke Gedeke, who was overwhelmed at guard as a rookie, and pushing him back out to tackle, and he filled in at right tackle. He did a nice job as a starter at right tackle. They draft Graham Barton at center, and he looked excellent in his preseason debut. Barton and Cody Mock, if they can get the most out of those guys, now we're talking an offensive line that looks much improved. And remember, this line struggled getting movement at the point of attack. And Barton, look, we have 1 preseason game of action under his belt here. By the time you listen to this, maybe there's 2 or 3. Maybe things have regressed. But Barton was one of those rare mauling type of left tackles in college, and it looked like he's able to carry that over to center. I think this might be the best run blocking unit the Bucs have had over the last couple of years. So I kind of like the offense for Baker Mayfield, as you mentioned. Rashad White did a pretty nice job as a feature back. They bring in Bucky Irving to take some pressure off him. So I really like the way the offense is constructed, and they've kind of gotten it back on track post-Tom Brady era.
No, I think that offensive group is definitely there to be a good team again. We'll see how Baker does in this offense again. Dave Canales did a fantastic job with him, but this is a group that should be solid.
Defensively, I feel like the story of the NFC South is questionable pass rushers. And,
right.
The Bucs having Shaq Barrett leave in the offseason and then eventually retire. I mean, they're relying on Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, who they turned down his 5th-year option as a former first-rounder. Yaya Diaby, who had a lot of sacks last year, didn't have a lot of just one-on-one pure production dominance as a pass rusher. They bring in Chris Braswell as a second-round pick out of Alabama. They have questions rushing the passer. Now, it's a blitz-heavy scheme. It's Todd Bowles. He likes to get after it, but I don't know if they have a whole bunch of true one-on-one winners on the outside.
No, definitely. And even inside, it's inconsistency. Vita Vea His highlight reel is phenomenal, but he's not as consistent as some of these other like truly special defensive tackles out there, guys that have that kind of physical skill set. And then Kalijah Kancey, the rookie from a year ago, this guy that his physical profile was almost identical to Aaron Donald, but he doesn't have Aaron Donald's technique, Aaron Donald's hand placement, Aaron Donald's ability to shed blocks. His arms are a little shorter than Aaron Donald, and that doesn't help when you're already an undersized guy. So Kancey's got burst, he's got explosiveness, he's got speed, but does he have the ability to, number one, hold up in the run game, and number two, consistently sort of defeat blocks rather than just rely on his athleticism and speed at this level? He needs to sort of develop in year two, because he was productive year one, but was a real liability against the run, and not as productive as you would want to see for somebody that you keep out there every single down.
The biggest question mark for me, Sam, I'm going to just jump to my key position. They traded Carlton Davis this offseason, and the Carlton Davis, Jamel Dean, former Auburn duo of just big physical corners, they had a really good run together. Just a really good run. Won a Super Bowl. And they trade Carlton Davis, and I don't think they have a great replacement on the roster. You know, the cornerback 2 spot, we're talking Zion McCollum, who's an athletic freak into year 3 of his NFL career. Josh Hayes, a 2023 6th-round pick. There's not a lot of experience or production there. McCollum had a 46 PFF coverage grade last year. Again, remember when Tariq Woolen had that incredible combine of, you know, size and speed, and we hadn't seen much like that at the cornerback position. McCollum was similar that year in 2022 at 6'2", 199, but he hasn't put it together yet. You know, 46 coverage grade, as I mentioned, 51 the year before. So I think they took a bit of a chance trading Carlton Davis and leaving that spot open. That's the one position battle, I guess, that I'm keeping an eye on and that they need to figure out, or else that dude's getting picked on.
No, definitely. It's a potential weakness now. They've sort of turned over that secondary. The slot, you know, they traded away or gotten rid of Sean Murphy-Bunting before that. So they've already kind of restocked the slot. I think that's in an okay position, Christian Eisen. But that Zion McCollum spot is a potential weakness. Now, maybe they love Zion McCollum because of that athleticism and that freakish speed and the size. And, you know, theoretically it's there. But Zion McCollum, coming out of, you know, a small school who hasn't dominated yet at the NFL level, that is a big risk to have him as your number 2 corner.
All right, paint a picture for me, your best case scenario here for the Bucs heading into the season.
Best case scenario is Baker Mayfield picks up where he left off, just repeats last season, and the Bucs have gotten, you know, the sort of rejuvenated version of Baker Mayfield, who maybe is not as good as sort of number 1 overall pick, like absolute future superstar, but has sort of settled in now to a good, productive, capable starting NFL quarterback type of role. And when you surround him with a good receiving core and have a good offensive line and a good run game, that's a group that can absolutely do some damage. So I think best case scenario is you just get a repetition of that Baker now that he's got the contract and now that you have a new offensive coordinator and system in place.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you there. Baker shows consistency. Mike Evans remains a stud. Graham Barton, builds on, the early success that he's had through camp in the preseason, and even some of the holes that they have defensively. I guess you're probably relying on Todd Bowles and his magic, the way he blitzes and keeps quarterbacks off balance, and all that comes together. And look, it still hasn't been a great division for a few years now, the NFC South. It's still a winnable division, really, for any of these teams if they catch fire. So the Bucs have a chance to, win the division once again and go and do damage in the playoffs. I don't know if they're ready to take over the best teams in the NFC. And look, I think the Eagles are one of the best teams in the NFC. I know they beat the Eagles last year in the playoffs pretty handily, but I think that was different circumstances where the Eagles were just absolutely reeling from what was happening internally. I'm not sure the Bucs are ready to take that next step, and so they'll have to figure that out, I think, this offseason. Worst case scenario wise, you call the Baker regression. All happens, and I think those defensive question marks remain questions at corner and then in rushing the passer with 4 men.
Yeah, worst case scenario is exactly that. Like you get a bad Baker Mayfield season, which which have tended in his career to follow good Baker Mayfield seasons, which is the concern from a Tampa Bay point of view. It's actually remarkable how much his career bounces around, good, bad, good, bad. So this was a huge season for him last season. The year before was catastrophic. And, you know, the worst case scenario is they just paid him. Okay, they didn't give him top of the market money or anything, but they just gave him a good contract. And if he just goes in the tank again, they're back to square one.
Just to recap what we're talking about so people can remember. Baker, the number 1 overall pick in 2018. We loved him. Said he was the clear number 1 in that draft. He wasn't. Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson were in that draft. But he looked like a star year 1. He was the best quarterback in that class as a rookie. Regressed in 2019. Pass blocking wasn't as good, but he regressed. 2020 has an excellent season after a slow start. One of the best quarterbacks in the NFL after week 7. They win a playoff game against the Steelers. It's like, all right, he's figured it out. 2021 gets injured, plays through a shoulder injury after week 2, has the worst PFF grade of his career to that point, makes no sense in line with everything else. And all the while, as his supporting cast seemingly got better, he got worse. As it looked like maybe the supporting cast wasn't as good, nothing made sense, right? He got better. And then disastrous times with the Rams, with the Panthers. But he also had one of those, like, I didn't even know the playbook and got off the plane and won a game with the Rams comeback, right? So it was just this roller coaster ride culminating in last year, you know, winning a playoff game and doing a nice job for the Bucs. So to say that you know what you're going to get from Baker Mayfield, you're lying. You're lying. There has not been a 2-season stretch of consistency in Baker's career, and we're heading into year 7.
Right, really in either direction, you know? Like, every year has been different to the last in some way. So, repetition of a Baker Mayfield season would be a huge win for Tampa Bay, and not repeating it would be their big concern.
All right, man, you ready to make some picks here in the NFC South?
Okay.
Let's do it. You're up.
Okay, winning the division. I have the Kirk Cousins-led Atlanta Falcons. Coming second in the division, I have the Baker Mayfield-led Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Third, I have the Saints, and then fourth, Carolina, albeit closer than last year.
Okay, I've got the same order. I hate that. Falcons, Bucks, Saints, and Panthers. I feel like a Saints hater on the show here today, but I'm a little bit down on them relative to where they've been.
I would be perfectly happy to flip a coin and go the other way with the Saints versus Bucks. I feel like those are very, very close, 2 and 3.
But we're both locked in. Look, the Falcons finished third in the division last year, but I think Cousins, new offense, the group of playmakers puts them over the top compared to these other teams in the league, in the division.
Yeah, I mean, Vegas agrees, right? As soon as they signed Cousins, they became the favorite for the division.
And again, if you're a Panthers fan, who knows? Maybe they could surprise, but you're just looking for signs of life coming out of Carolina at the quarterback position in particular. So, all right, man, that's NFC South down. We got the NFC West coming up next. We appreciate everybody for finding Check the Mic and joining us. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening to us. From a podcast perspective, if you're on YouTube, hit the subscribe button as well. We'll be giving you the same long-form analysis all during the season, in the offseason, breaking down all of the team-building moves, and, of course, review and preview every single NFL game during the season, Sam. We'll be here quite a bit. So thanks to everybody for joining and finding Check the Mic. We'll see you next time with the NFC West.